The dormitory door exploded inward with a thunderous crash that shook the entire hallway. Marcus Chen jolted upright in his bed, his heart hammering against his ribcage as armed police officers flooded into his small room like a dark tide. The overhead fluorescent light blazed to life, casting harsh shadows across the faces of men in tactical gear who shouted commands he could not hear. Their mouths moved frantically, lips forming words that meant nothing to him in the chaos, while red and blue lights from squad cars outside painted the walls in alternating waves of color. "Hands where we can see them," Officer Rodriguez bellowed, his voice cutting through the pre-dawn air like a blade. But Marcus, 17 years old and profoundly deaf since birth, saw only the aggressive gestures, the weapons pointed in his direction, the terror in his roommate's eyes as Jake scrambled backward against the far wall. Marcus raised his hand slowly, his fingers trembling as he tried to sign that he was deaf, that he needed an interpreter, that there had been some terrible mistake. The officers ignored his desperate hand movements, mistaking his attempts at communication for potential threats. One grabbed his wrists roughly, forcing them behind his back, while cold metal handcuffs bit into his skin. Marcus felt the vibrations of heavy boots on the linoleum floor, sensed the aggressive energy radiating from the men who surrounded him, but could not comprehend the reason for this nightmare that had invaded his sanctuary. 3 hours earlier, Karen Henderson had dialed 911 from her perfectly manicured living room in the faculty housing complex. Her voice carried the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being heard, respected, feared. She had worked at Riverside Academy for the Deaf for 15 years as an administrative coordinator, a position that gave her access to student records, dormitory layouts, and the intimate details of young lives she was meant to protect. "I need to report a serious threat," she told the emergency dispatcher, her words measured and deliberate. "There's a student here, Marcus Chen, and I have evidence that he's planning violence against other students. I've seen his writings, his drawings. This needs immediate attention." The dispatcher's keyboard clattered as she typed, "What kind of evidence are we talking about, ma'am?" "Detailed plans, sketches of weapons, lists of names." Karen lied smoothly, her eyes scanning the poetry notebook she had confiscated from Marcus 3 days earlier during a routine room inspection. The pages were filled with beautiful, complex verses written in both English and American Sign Language notation, abstract drawings that captured the visual poetry of signed communication, and lists of classmates he admired or wanted to include in his upcoming ASL poetry performance. But Karen saw only what her prejudices allowed her to see. Marcus had been her problem since the day he arrived at Riverside Academy 2 years ago. Unlike many of the other deaf students who seemed grateful for any attention from hearing faculty, Marcus carried himself with quiet confidence. He questioned policies that seemed discriminatory, advocated for better accommodations, and had the audacity to correct Karen's elementary ASL attempts during staff meetings. His intelligence threatened her authority, his advocacy challenged her comfort zone, and his success made her feel inadequate in ways she refused to acknowledge. The raid unfolded with military precision. Marcus watched in horror as officers tore through his belongings, scattering textbooks, clothes, and personal mementos across the floor like debris from an explosion. They found his poetry notebook, the very one Karen had secretly photographed and misrepresented, and held it aloft as evidence of wrongdoing. The officer in charge, Sergeant Williams, flipped through the pages with growing confusion, unable to decipher the ASL notation or understand the artistic metaphors that filled Marcus's work. "What's all this signing stuff?" Williams asked another officer, pointing to Marcus's carefully drawn hand-shaped diagrams that illustrated the visual components of his poems. "Looks like some kind of code to me," replied Officer Martinez, his voice heavy with suspicion. Could be gang signs. Could be worse. Marcus watched their lips move, reading the fragments of conversation he could catch, feeling his stomach drop as he realized they were treating his art, his passion, his very identity as evidence of criminal intent. He tried again to sign, his hands moving in fluid, desperate gestures that conveyed his innocence, his confusion, his need for understanding. But the officers stepped back, interpreting his graceful movements as aggressive behavior. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the school's vice principal and a fluent ASL interpreter, received the emergency call at her home just as dawn was breaking over the campus. Her hands shook as she dressed quickly, her mind racing through the impossibility of what she had been told. Marcus Chen, one of their most talented and gentle students, accused of planning violence, the boy who wrote poetry that could make grown adults weep, who mentored younger deaf children, who had never so much as raised his voice in anger. By the time Dr. Rodriguez arrived at the dormitory, Marcus had been transported to the county jail for questioning. The hallway buzzed with activity as other students emerged from their rooms, their faces etched with confusion and fear. Jake Morrison, Marcus's roommate, sat on his bed wrapped in a blanket, his entire body trembling from shock. "What happened here?" Dr. Rodriguez signed to Jake, her movements precise despite her emotional turmoil. "They took Marcus." Jake signed back, tears streaming down his face. "They wouldn't listen when we tried to tell them he was deaf. They treated him like a criminal, like a terrorist." Dr. Rodriguez, "Marcus would never hurt anyone. You know that, right?" Dr. Rodriguez knelt beside Marcus's scattered belongings, picking up pages of his poetry that had been torn and scattered. She read his words, his beautiful, complex verses about identity, belonging, and the challenge of existing between the hearing and deaf worlds. Her heart broke as she realized what had happened, how his artistic expressions had been twisted into something sinister by minds that could not or would not understand. At the police station, Marcus sat in a windowless interrogation room, his hands cuffed to a metal table that felt cold against his palms. Detective Sarah Lynch entered with a stack of photocopied pages from his notebook, her expression stern and unforgiving. She had built her career on reading people, on detecting deception, and uncovering hidden truths. But she had never interrogated a deaf suspect before, and her prejudices clouded her judgment from the first moment. "We know what you were planning," Detective Lynch said, pointing to a page covered with Marcus's ASL poetry notation. Her words were lost on Marcus, who watched her lips move and tried desperately to understand, when he reached up to point to his ears and shake his head, indicating his deafness. Lynch interpreted the gesture as defiance. "Don't play games with me, kid," she continued, raising her voice as if volume could bridge the communication gap. "We have evidence of your plans, your target lists, your weapon diagrams." Marcus's eyes filled with tears of frustration as he realized the magnitude of the misunderstanding. His poetry, his art, his deepest expressions of creativity and emotion were being used as weapons against him. He tried to sign, his movements becoming more frantic as desperation took hold. But Lynch only saw what she expected to see, a guilty suspect trying to evade responsibility. The breakthrough came when Dr. Rodriguez finally arrived at the police station with the school's attorney, demanding immediate access to Marcus and proper accommodations for the interrogation. She burst into the observation room where Captain Morrison was watching Lynch's futile attempts at communication. "This is a violation of ADA protocols," Dr. Rodriguez declared, her voice cutting through the tension like a surgical blade. "That boy is profoundly deaf. And you've been interrogating him for 3 hours without an interpreter. Nothing he said or failed to say can be used against him legally." Captain Morrison turned to face her, his weathered features creasing with confusion. The complainant said he was planning an attack on other students. She provided evidence. "What evidence?" Dr. Rodriguez demanded. "Show me exactly what you think proves this boy is dangerous." When they laid out Marcus's poetry notebook, Dr. Rodriguez felt her blood pressure spike. Page after page of beautiful, complex verse lay before them. Visual poetry that celebrated deaf culture, explored themes of isolation and connection, and painted vivid pictures of a young man's search for his place in the world. The hand-shaped diagrams they had mistaken for weapon schematics were actually artistic representations of signs, showing how hand positions and movements could create meaning as profound as any spoken word. "This is poetry," Dr. Rodriguez said, her voice thick with emotion. "This page you thought was a target list. These are classmates he wants to invite to perform in an ASL poetry showcase next month. These weapon diagrams, they're illustrations of sign language handshapes, visual representations of how signs are formed. This boy isn't planning violence. He's creating art." The interrogation room fell silent as the magnitude of their mistake became clear. Marcus looked up as Dr. Rodriguez entered, his face streaked with tears of relief at seeing someone who could finally understand him. His hands moved in rapid, fluid signs as he tried to explain what had happened, his story pouring out in gestures that painted a picture of innocence, destroyed by ignorance. "They took my words," Marcus signed, his movements sharp with pain. "My poems, my dreams, everything I am. They made it evil when it was supposed to be beautiful." Dr. Rodriguez translated for the officers, watching as shame and realization dawned on their faces. Detective Lynch sank into her chair, the weight of her error settling on her shoulders like a crushing burden. She had built her career on understanding human nature, yet she had failed to recognize the most basic humanity in the young man she had terrorized. The real investigation began immediately. When officers arrived at Karen Henderson's house with a warrant, they found a treasure trove of evidence that painted a disturbing picture of systematic harassment and deliberate false reporting. Karen's personal computer contained hundreds of screenshots of student social media posts, private communications she had illegally accessed, and detailed profiles of students she deemed problematic, most of whom, like Marcus, were deaf students from minority backgrounds who had challenged her authority or requested better accommodations. In her desk drawer, investigators discovered the original copy of Marcus's poetry notebook, along with Karen's handwritten notes, analyzing how she could reframe his innocent words as evidence of dangerous intent. Email records showed she had been planning this accusation for weeks, waiting for the right moment to strike. Phone records revealed previous calls to various authorities about other students, calls that had been dismissed or resulted in brief investigations that found no wrongdoing. The pattern was clear and chilling. Karen Henderson had weaponized her position of authority to systematically target students who threatened her sense of control, using false accusations and manufactured evidence to destroy young lives she viewed as inconvenient or challenging. Word of Marcus's arrest spread through the deaf community like wildfire. Social media exploded with outrage as the details emerged, with hashtags like "Justice for Marcus" and "Deaf Rights Now" trending nationally. Parents, students, advocacy groups, and allies flooded the school with demands for accountability, transparency, and systemic change. Riverside Academy called an emergency community meeting for the following evening. The auditorium filled beyond capacity as students, parents, faculty, and community members gathered to address the crisis. The air crackled with tension, anger, and determination as Dr. Patricia Hawthorne, the school's president, took the stage. "We are here tonight because one of our own was betrayed." Dr. Hawthorne began, her words accompanied by fluent ASL interpretation, projected on large screens throughout the auditorium. Marcus Chen, a gifted student, a talented poet, and a valued member of our community, was subjected to a horrific ordeal based on lies and prejudice. Marcus sat in the front row, flanked by his parents who had flown in from California, their faces etched with pain and pride as they watched their son's community rally around him. His mother, Lisa Chen, had spent the previous day reading through his confiscated poetry, weeping at the beauty of his words and the cruelty of their misrepresentation. "Doctor!" Rodriguez took the microphone next, her voice carrying the weight of years of advocacy and education. "What happened to Marcus is not an isolated incident," she declared. "It is the result of systemic prejudice, of people in positions of power who view deaf culture, deaf communication, and deaf identity as inherently suspicious or threatening." The crowd erupted in applause and signed appreciation, a sea of hands moving in unified support. Student after student came forward to share their own experiences with Karen Henderson's harassment, painting a picture of years of discrimination disguised as administrative efficiency. Sarah Martinez, a senior, signed her testimony with tears streaming down her face. "Karen confiscated my journal last year, claiming I was writing inappropriate content about other students. It was poetry about my girlfriend, about being gay and deaf and trying to find my place in the world. She tried to get me expelled, said I was a bad influence on younger students." David Kim, a junior from South Korea, added his voice to the growing chorus. "She reported me to immigration services, claimed I was here illegally, and posed a security risk. My visa was valid, my paperwork perfect, but I spent months in legal limbo while they investigated her lies." Story after story emerged, each one revealing another layer of Karen's systematic campaign of harassment. The pattern became undeniable. She had targeted students of color, LGBTQ+ students, international students, anyone who represented change or challenged her narrow worldview. Karen herself was noticeably absent from the meeting. She had been placed on immediate administrative leave and was facing multiple criminal charges, including filing false reports, harassment, and civil rights violations. Her lawyer had advised her to avoid public appearances, but her absence only served to highlight the cowardice behind her actions. Marcus finally stood to address the assembly, his hands moving with the grace and precision that had made his poetry so powerful. "Doctor." Rodriguez interpreted his words for the hearing members of the audience, her voice carrying his message with reverence and strength. "They tried to make my words into weapons." Marcus signed, his movements flowing like water despite the tremor in his hands. "They took my poetry, my dreams, my identity, and twisted them into something ugly and dangerous. But they failed to understand something fundamental about the deaf community. We are stronger than their ignorance." He paused, looking around the auditorium at the hundreds of faces watching him, signing to him, supporting him with their presence and their solidarity. "My words were not weapons. They were bridges," he continued. "Bridges between worlds, between experiences, between hearts that beat with the same hopes and fears regardless of how we communicate. No one can destroy those bridges except us, by letting fear and prejudice divide us." The applause was thunderous, a combination of clapping and signed appreciation that filled the auditorium with visible and audible support. Marcus's parents embraced him as he returned to his seat, their pride evident in every gesture, every tear, every protective touch. Dr. Hawthorne returned to the podium for the final portion of the meeting, her expression resolute as she outlined the actions the school would take in response to the crisis. Effective immediately, Karen Henderson's employment with Riverside Academy has been terminated, she announced. Her words met with a wave of approval from the crowd. Additionally, we are implementing comprehensive policy changes to prevent such abuse of power in the future. The new policies were extensive and transformative. All faculty and staff would undergo mandatory training in deaf culture and disability rights. Student privacy protections would be strengthened, with clear protocols for accessing personal belongings or communications. An independent ombudsman would be appointed to investigate complaints against faculty members. Most importantly, students would have direct representation on the disciplinary committee, ensuring their voices could never again be ignored or dismissed. As the official meeting concluded, the community's work was just beginning. A defense fund was established to help Marcus's family cover legal expenses and provide counseling support. Students organized a campus-wide poetry festival to celebrate deaf culture and showcase the beauty of ASL literature. Local deaf advocacy groups launched a broader campaign to address discrimination in educational settings throughout the state. The legal proceedings moved swiftly once the evidence against Karen became public. She was charged with filing false police reports, harassment, civil rights violations, and abuse of her position as a public employee. The district attorney, influenced by the overwhelming evidence and public attention, pursued the charges aggressively. Karen's first court appearance drew protesters from across the region. The courthouse steps filled with deaf community members, civil rights activists, and allies holding signs demanding justice. Marcus stood with his parents and legal team, watching as the woman who had tried to destroy his life was led into the building in handcuffs. The arraignment was brief but significant. Karen Henderson, once so confident in her authority and righteousness, appeared diminished and defeated as she pleaded not guilty to all charges. Her attorney requested bail, but the judge, citing the extensive evidence of ongoing harassment and the potential for further victim intimidation, denied the request. Ms. Henderson used her position of trust to systematically target vulnerable students. Judge Patricia Martinez declared from the bench, "The evidence suggests a pattern of behavior that poses an ongoing threat to the very community she was hired to serve. Bail is denied." The civil lawsuits followed quickly. Marcus's family, supported by major disability rights organizations, filed a comprehensive suit against Karen, the school district, and the police department for civil rights violations, emotional distress, and systematic discrimination. Other students who had been targeted by Karen joined the legal action, creating a powerful coalition seeking both justice and institutional change. The school district's insurance company, recognizing the strength of the evidence and the public relations nightmare, pushed for quick settlements. The police department, embarrassed by their handling of the initial arrest and interrogation, agreed to comprehensive policy changes and officer training programs. 3 months after the raid that had shattered his world, Marcus stood once again before a packed auditorium. But this time, he was not a victim seeking justice. He was an artist sharing his gift with a community that had rallied to protect him. The ASL poetry showcase that Karen had tried to prevent through her false accusations had evolved into something far more powerful, a celebration of resilience, creativity, and the unbreakable bonds of community solidarity. Marcus's opening poem was titled "Silent Storm," a powerful piece about the violence of misunderstanding and the healing power of truth. His hands moved through the air like dancers, each gesture carrying layers of meaning that transcended the boundaries between signed and spoken language. The audience watched in rapt attention as he painted pictures with his fingers, told stories with the angle of his wrists, and created music through the rhythm of his movements. In the silence between heartbeats, he signed, his movements flowing like poetry itself. Lives a language older than words, deeper than sound, truer than the lies they tell about us. We speak with our hands because our hearts are too full for voice alone. The performance was recorded and shared across social media platforms, reaching millions of viewers and educating countless people about the beauty and complexity of deaf culture. Messages of support poured in from around the world, from deaf communities that recognized their own struggles in Marcus's story, from hearing allies who were moved by his resilience and grace. Karen Henderson's trial began on a cold January morning, exactly 6 months after her arrest. The courtroom was packed with Marcus's supporters, media representatives, and civil rights observers who had come to witness justice in action. The evidence against her was overwhelming and undeniable. Hundreds of pages of documentation showing her systematic harassment of students, her deliberate fabrication of evidence, and her abuse of institutional power. The prosecution's case was devastating in its thoroughness. Witnesses testified about years of harassment, discrimination, and intimidation. Computer forensic experts presented evidence of Karen's illegal access to student records and communications. Police officers admitted their failures in handling Marcus's arrest, acknowledging how their prejudices had made them complicit in Karen's scheme. Karen's defense attorney attempted to portray her actions as misguided concern for student safety, but the evidence made such claims laughable. The jury, which included 2 deaf members and multiple parents of disabled children, saw through every attempt at justification and mitigation. Marcus himself testified on the 3rd day of the trial, his words interpreted with precision and power as he described the impact of Karen's actions on his life, his education, and his sense of security. His testimony was heartbreaking and inspiring in equal measure, showcasing both the devastating effects of discrimination and the remarkable strength of the human spirit. She tried to turn my identity into a crime. Marcus signed, his testimony flowing through the interpreter's voice with quiet dignity. She took the things that made me who I am, my language, my culture, my way of seeing the world, and tried to make them evidence of evil intent. But she failed to understand that deaf culture is built on survival, on finding connection despite barriers, on creating beauty from silence. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They found Karen Henderson guilty on all charges. Their verdict read in a courtroom so silent that the only sounds were the quiet sobs of relief from Marcus's family and supporters. Judge Martinez scheduled sentencing for the following month, allowing time for victim impact statements and community input. The sentencing hearing became a community catharsis. Dozens of students, parents, and community members spoke about the impact of Karen's actions, not just on Marcus, but on the broader deaf community's sense of safety and belonging. Their statements painted a picture of systemic harm that went far beyond one false accusation, revealing the deep wounds inflicted by years of discrimination and institutional indifference. Judge Martinez, a seasoned jurist known for her fairness and thorough consideration of all factors, delivered a sentence that reflected both the severity of Karen's crimes and the community's need for healing. Karen Henderson was sentenced to 18 months in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. She was ordered to pay full restitution to Marcus's family for legal fees and counseling costs, totaling over $75,000. Additionally, she was required to fund and participate in a comprehensive disability awareness and sensitivity training program for educators throughout the state. Ms. Henderson's actions represent more than individual criminal behavior. Judge Martinez declared as she delivered the sentence. They reflect systemic prejudices that have no place in our educational institutions or our society. This sentence serves not only to punish wrongdoing, but to send a clear message that discrimination and harassment will not be tolerated, particularly when directed against our most vulnerable community members. Perhaps most significantly, Karen was permanently banned from working in any educational institution serving disabled students. Her teaching credentials were revoked, her access to school systems terminated, and her ability to harm future generations of deaf students eliminated. The aftermath of the trial brought profound changes that extended far beyond Riverside Academy. The case became a catalyst for legislative action, with state lawmakers introducing comprehensive bills to protect disabled students from discrimination and harassment. School districts across the country reviewed their policies and procedures, recognizing the legal and moral imperatives for change. Marcus's story inspired the creation of the Deaf Student Advocacy Network, a national organization dedicated to protecting deaf students' rights and providing resources for families facing similar challenges. The organization, founded with some of the settlement money from the civil lawsuits, quickly grew to serve thousands of families across the country. Riverside Academy became a model for inclusive education, implementing innovations that were studied and replicated at schools around the world. The campus culture transformed from one of institutional hierarchy to collaborative community, with students playing active roles in governance and policymaking. On a warm spring evening, exactly 1 year after the raid that had nearly destroyed his faith in justice, Marcus stood once again on the steps of the dormitory where his nightmare had begun. But now, those steps were crowded with friends, supporters, and fellow students who had gathered for the unveiling of a new memorial garden dedicated to student resilience and community solidarity. The garden featured plants and trees from around the world, representing the diverse backgrounds of Riverside's student body. At its center stood a sculpture created by Marcus himself, a bronze tree with branches that formed sign language hand shapes, each one representing a different word: courage, justice, community, hope. This garden grows from the soil of our struggles. Marcus signed as he addressed the crowd gathered for the dedication ceremony. Every plant here represents a student who refused to be silenced, who chose growth over bitterness, who built bridges instead of walls. We plant these seeds not to forget our pain, but to show that from the darkest earth can come the most beautiful blooms. His mother, Lisa Chen, watched from the crowd with tears streaming down her face. The trauma of nearly losing her son to false accusations had transformed into fierce pride as she witnessed his growth into a powerful advocate and leader. His father, standing beside her with his arm around her shoulders, signed his love and support for his remarkable son. Dr. Rodriguez, now promoted to president of Riverside Academy, spoke about the institutional changes that had grown from Marcus's courage to speak truth to power. The school had become a national leader in inclusive education, attracting students and faculty from around the world who wanted to be part of an institution committed to justice and equality. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Marcus lingered in the garden with his closest friends. The evening air was warm and gentle, filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation in multiple languages and communication modes. Students signed to each other under the glow of solar-powered lights, their hands moving in graceful conversations that painted the darkness with meaning and connection. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been so strong?" asked Sarah Martinez, his friend who had also been targeted by Karen's harassment campaigns. Marcus considered the question carefully, his eyes scanning the garden that had grown from his ordeal. I think about it sometimes." He signed thoughtfully. "But then, I realize that strength isn't something you have or don't have. It's something you discover when you have no other choice." Karen thought she could break me by attacking my words, my identity, my community, but she didn't understand that these things become stronger when they're tested. He paused, watching as younger deaf students practiced their poetry performances near the sculpture, their movements fluid and confident in ways that would have been impossible before the community's transformation. She thought my silence was weakness. Marcus continued, his signs growing more animated as passion filled his movements. But she never understood that in our silence lives a language more powerful than any sound. In our difference lives a strength she couldn't comprehend. In our community lives a love she couldn't destroy. As the last lights went out in the dormitory windows and the campus settled into peaceful quiet, Marcus walked slowly through the garden paths, touching each plant and tree, reading the small plaques that bore the names of students who had contributed to this space of healing and hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to advocate and educate, new chances to build bridges between worlds. But tonight, in this garden born from injustice and nurtured by community love, Marcus felt the deep satisfaction of transformation complete. His words had been tested in fire and emerged stronger. His community had been attacked and responded with unity. His identity had been questioned and affirmed itself with unprecedented power. The false accusations that were meant to silence him had instead amplified his voice. The hatred that was meant to isolate him had instead connected him to a global network of allies and advocates. The injustice that was meant to destroy him had instead become the foundation for systemic change that would protect countless future students. As he walked back toward his dormitory, Marcus's hands moved unconsciously in the signs of his latest poem, a piece about gardens and growth, about communities that bloom in the darkness, about the unbreakable bonds between those who choose love over fear. His words flowed silently through the night air, carried on gentle breezes to touch the dreams of sleeping students who would wake tomorrow in a world made safer by his courage. The memorial garden would grow and flourish in the years to come, tended by students who understood its deeper meaning. Each new bloom would carry the message that Marcus had written in bronze and living green, that truth grows strongest in the soil of adversity, that justice flowers most beautifully when planted by hands that have known injustice, and that love creates the most magnificent gardens when it grows from hearts that have chosen forgiveness over revenge. In the quiet darkness of the campus night, Marcus's story continued to unfold, not as a tale of victimization overcome, but as a testament to the transformative power of communities that refuse to let their most vulnerable members stand alone. His words, once twisted into weapons against him, had become tools of healing and change. His identity, once used as evidence of dangerous difference, had become a beacon of strength for others facing similar challenges. And in the memorial garden that grew from the soil of his ordeal, future generations of students would find not only beauty and peace, but also the enduring message that justice delayed is not justice denied when communities have the courage to demand truth, to fight for their own, and to plant seeds of hope in even the darkest ground.